In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a granny square cardigan. First, I will go over how to determine the sizes and number of squares that you need, as well as the layout that I use on placement for sewing them together. I will then guide you through alterations that you can make to improve the overall fit of your cardigan. And lastly, I will go over step-by-step tutorials on finishing details such as sleeve cuffs and button bands. Before I get started, I would like to point out that the written instructions on my website, as well as the video that I'm showing here, are meant to be used as a made-to-measure guideline. Although I do have specific sizes listed in the written pattern, depending on your gauge and the yarn size that you use, you may have sizes that fall somewhere in between. Now, I have a formula that I will be sharing with you shortly that you can use to check the finished size of your squares and see if they will make a cardigan that works for your desired size. To start the cardigan, you will be making the granny squares first. Now, I use traditional granny squares for my cardigans. However, you can substitute those with whichever type of granny square that you prefer. I also like to use the condensed version of the granny square, and what that means is that I don't put chain spaces in between my clusters of granny stitches. And the reason I do this is just to keep things a little bit more compact, and also it kind of helps eliminate some of the stretching that will occur over time. Now, I am not going to be showing you how to make a granny square, so that way you can choose whatever type of granny square that you prefer, and it's also going to save some time on this tutorial. However, I do have a video that shows how to make the traditional granny square as well as this condensed version here, and I will link it below. The next question you might be asking yourself is, how big do I make my squares? I have a measurement guideline on the written tutorial on my website that shows approximately how big your cardigan will be in relation to your granny square size. Now, because of gauge and the size of yarn that you may use or the type of square that you use, this might be different for everyone. So for example, I typically use light worsted or DK weight yarn, and generally each round gives me about an inch. So if I make an 8-inch square, this usually works out to be about 8 rounds of the traditional granny square. However, this might be different for you. To determine the overall circumference of your cardigan, I'm going to give you this simple formula. I also have this graphic. This is also available on my website that kind of just explains how I come up with this formula. You're going to take your granny square size and you're going to measure it from one side to the other. Then you're going to take that width and take it times 3. So that gives us the measurement along the back panel of our cardigan. Then you're going to take that number and take it times 2. That's going to give you the total circumference of the front and back panels. Now, I know our front panel is open here in the front, but it's just going to give us the circumference if the cardigan is laid down flat. Going back to my example of the 8-inch squares that I use, if I take 8 times 3, that gives me a back panel width of 24. I'll then take 24 times 2, and that will give me an overall circumference of 48 inches. Now, your square may not be a whole number after you finish measuring it. It might be, let's say, 8 3/4 of an inch. So if you take 8 3/4 times 3, you get a width of 26 1/4. Then you would take that number times 2, and it would give you a total circumference of 52 1/2. Another thing that you might want to factor in is the overall ease of the cardigan. Now, when we're talking about ease, we're talking about the space between the actual cardigan itself and your physical body. So if you want a cardigan that's slightly oversized, you're going to factor in a few more inches of ease versus a cardigan that's more tight to your body. You want it to be closer to the actual body measurements. Later, I will show you alterations that you can make to your cardigan after you have sewn your squares together. I will show you how to add a little bit of ease to the body circumference as well as the arm circumference by making a gusset. I will also show you how you can add additional length to your sleeves before you add the sleeve cuffs, as well as additional length to the bottom. So if your sweater is close to the overall measurements that you want, but it's falling somewhere in between, you can make these alterations after you put it together that will improve the fit. If you're unsure of the size of your granny squares, start by making a granny square with 4 rounds like I've done here, and then measure it. So you can see that, like I explained before, my granny squares typically go about 1 round per inch. So I have 4 inches for the width of my granny square. And now you can continue to add additional rounds to your square until it is the width that you want. After you've determined the final size for your test square, you're going to want to make more squares. So I typically use 23 squares for my cardigans, and this represents the back panel here, and these 2 shapes in the front represent the front panels. So if you'd like to make a longer cardigan, you can continue to add more squares to this back panel and to these 2 sides of the front panel. If you'd like a more cropped version, you might want to eliminate these sets of squares and these 2 in the front. This is entirely up to you. After you have made all of your squares, it is then time to sew them together. And once again, you can use this graphic as a guide on where to place them. Now, I kind of just like to lay them out on the floor or on the bed, especially if I'm using squares that have different colors. I just kind of like to place them out ahead of time to determine where I'm going to sew them. Once again, just to save time for this tutorial, because I'm going to be explaining a lot about different alterations you can make, I'm not going to show you how to sew them together. However, I do have 2 videos that I will link below that might be helpful. The first one, I go over 4 different methods that you can use to seam crochet pieces together, so you can kind of determine which one will work for you. I also have a join as you go tutorial that shows you how you can join your squares together in the final round without having to do any sewing. So I will link those below. Here is what the cardigan looks like after I have sewn together all of my squares. Obviously, this was too large to fit on my desk, so I've laid it out here on the floor so that you can see. And now I'm going to start at the top sleeve seam, so right here and on this side right here, and I'm just going to fold it in half. This is the front view of the cardigan after I folded it in half, and you can kind of see where I've just slightly folded the front panels away from the center so that you can see where they're at. The next thing that I'm going to do is what I like to kind of refer to as the rough draft first try on. So before I seam along the bottom edges of my sleeves and the side panels of my cardigan, I'm going to just pin them together loosely, and I've just used some stitch markers here. You can also use safety pins and just kind of pin along the side and then try my cardigan on to make sure that the size is going to work. As you're trying your cardigan on for the first time, you may want to take notes of places that you can make alterations. So the first measurement that you're going to check is the overall length, and that's from the shoulders down to the bottom. This is where you can decide if you want to make additional rows of granny squares or remove one if you like. Now I'm going to show you how to make a bottom hem of ribbing, and this bottom hem is usually about 1 to 2 inches. If you're somewhere in between making a whole other row of granny squares and just making the bottom hem, you can also add additional rows of just the granny stitch along the bottom. Another measurement that you might want to look at is your overall sleeve length. Now, once again, we're going to be making cuffs around the bottom. And these cuffs are typically 1 to 2 inches again. You may want to make additional rounds of granny stitch around the bottom before you make the cuff. The final place that you want to check is the overall sleeve circumference and body circumference. Now, if it's really close to where you like it, but you'd like to add just a couple more inches, you can make what's called a sleeve gusset that goes along the bottom part of the sleeve and the sides, where you're just adding an additional row of the granny stitch. And this is what you want to do before you seam the bottom part of your sleeves and the side panel. If you would like to add a little more extra room along your sleeve and body circumference, I'm going to show you quickly how to make a gusset. However, if you're satisfied with these measurements, then you can skip forward to the next part where I talk about seaming the bottom of the sleeve and the side panels together. If you'd like to add a little more room to your sleeve and body circumference, I'm going to show you how to make a gusset. Now, the gusset will go from the end of your sleeve, which this is going to be our sleeve cuff, from the end of our sleeve along the bottom of the sleeve to the underarm, and then from the underarm down along the side of the body. And this is done before we seam the bottom of our sleeve and our side panel shut. If we're making it along one side, then we need to mirror that on the other side, and that's so that our granny stitches sort of line up as we sew. Now I'm going to be using green yarn here to show the gusset, and that's just so that you can see the stitches a little more clearly. So I'm going to begin by making a slip knot, and I'm going to join in the corner and pull my yarn through. And then I just chain one. Now you can join your yarn with whichever method you prefer. Then I'm going to chain 3, so this counts as our first double crochet. And then I'm just going to be putting one more double crochet in this corner. Now if you've added chain stitches, you could chain stitch here for your granny square. Since I'm using the condensed version, I'm just going to jump ahead to this next space, and I'm just going to make granny stitches along. So I'm going to be putting 3 double crochets into each of these spaces, and I'm going to continue to do that until I get to my next join, which is right here. And here I've come to my first spot where I've joined my granny squares. There's a couple of different options that you can do. You can just work 1 double crochet into one space and 2 double crochets in the next space if you like. You're just making another cluster of stitches. I like to actually add 2 double crochets to each of these spots. It just adds a little bit more reinforcement. So when I come to one of these chain 2 spaces or chain 3 spaces that have made my corner, I'm just going to put 2 double crochets in that one and 2 double crochets in the next one. And then when I work on my other side, I'm just going to mirror the same thing by placing 2 and 2, but you can do this however you prefer. And I'm going to continue to add more of these double crochet granny stitches until I get to the bottom corner of my underarm. And now I've reached the underarm, and you can kind of see where I have 3 granny squares that are joining together. So I'm going to do the same thing as I did in my seam over here. I'm going to start in my first corner right here. This was the corner of our granny square, and I'm going to place 2 double crochets in that corner. Then I'm going to go into this one that's kind of in the center here, and I'm going to place 2 double crochets in that corner. And then my last granny square corner here, I'm just going to do the same thing and place 2 double crochets in that corner. And just remember that you're going to mirror this on the other side. Then I'm just going to continue along working in the granny stitch until I get down to the bottom hem of my cardigan. So now I have worked along the side of my body and I've reached the end. So this is the bottom of my cardigan here. I'm just going to put 2 double crochets into that final corner space and fasten off. Here is the first half of our gusset. So we began here at the end of the sleeve and worked along the bottom of the sleeve to the underarm. And then this is along the side of the front panel. So now I need to mirror this on the other side. So I'm just going to take my cardigan and flip it over So now this is the back panel that I'm going to be working on and the back of the sleeve. So typically I work from right to left, so I would actually begin along the back panel this time. And I'm going to start in this bottom corner, and I'm just going to mirror the same thing that I did when I made the first half of my gusset. So I'm going to join in this bottom corner with my yarn, and chain up 3 and work my first double crochet. And then I'm just going to continue to work the granny stitch just like I did before. But this time we're working up the side of the body first and then toward the sleeve. And now I've finished both sides of my gusset here, so you can see that when I fold these over, this is where I would be seaming them together, and they line up really nicely. If you like, you can add an additional row or two to your gusset if you need just a little bit more extra room. Otherwise, you're ready to seam up the sleeves and sides of your cardigan. If you're satisfied with the overall circumference of your sleeves and your body, then you can finish the final parts of sewing your cardigan together. So I have my sleeve end right here, so this is where the cuff will be, and I've left my stitch markers in place, and I'm just going to go along and sew from the sleeve cuff along the bottom edge of the sleeve until I get to the underarm. And then from the underarm, I'm going to seam the front and back panels together along the side. And then I will repeat that on the other side as well. Once your cardigan is all sewn together, it's time to add the finishing touches. So the next thing that I'm going to show you is how to finish the sleeves and add the cuffs. Now, if you remember before where I talked about places that you might want to add additional length, one of those was the sleeves. Now, if you try your cardigan on and you realize that just a small cuff is going to work out great for you, then you can go ahead and skip forward to where I talk about how to make the cuff. However, if you'd like to make a few additional rounds to the bottom of your sleeve to add additional length, I'm going to show you how to do that here. So I'm going to start with a slip knot. And I'm going to start on the bottom side. So this is the bottom seam where we just last sewed. And I'm going to go into one of the corner spaces of my granny squares. And I'm going to join that slip knot. Now you can use whatever joining method you prefer. I'm just showing you what I like to do here. And I'm going to bring my hook through, and then I'm going to chain 1 and sort of cinch that down nice and tight. Now I'm going to be placing 2 double crochets in each of the corners from our granny square. So to finish this, I'm going to go ahead and chain up 3. That counts as our first double crochet. And then I'm going to place 1 more double crochet in this corner space. Now, if you worked chains in between your granny clusters, you would chain here, but since I'm doing the condensed version of this, I'm just going to jump right into my next space in between those 3 double crochets. I'm going to place 3 more double crochets. So basically I'm just going to be adding another round to the granny square, except I'm going to be working all the way around the bottom of the sleeve and joining in the round. So continue to add 3 double crochets in between the 3 double crochet clusters from the previous round. And eventually you're going to get to a spot where your granny squares have been sewn together, and I'll show you what to do there. And now I've come to a seam where I've sewn 2 granny squares together, and I have my 2 corner spaces here. And I'm just going to kind of split those in 2. So I'm going to place 1 double crochet in the first one and 2 in the second, and you can split those however you like. Just so I'm still placing 3 double crochets in that space. You can also use this if you've added a gusset to the bottom of your sleeve. And I'm just going to continue to work in the granny stitch, placing those 3 double crochet granny clusters until I get to the end of my round. I'm just finishing up my last double crochet in that cluster here, and now I've come back to my beginning seam. So I placed 2 double crochets on this side, so to finish my round I'm just going to place 1 double crochet in this corner here, and then I'm going to join with a slip stitch in the top of that original chain 3. Now if I wanted to continue to add additional rounds, I would just simply slip stitch over to my next space between those clusters, those 3 double crochet clusters, and then I would chain 3 and begin another round of the granny stitch. However, if you like where your sleeves are at, you can just end after joining in the top of that chain 3. Now I'm going to show you how I make the cuffs for the sleeves. Now if you added additional rounds, you wouldn't fasten off, you would just continue right where you left off. But if you did not make additional rounds, you're going to join or make a slip knot here and then join your yarn. I like to start in the bottom corner on that bottom seam of the sleeve and just grab my slip knot there and pull it through, yarn over and chain 1 and then cinch it down. But you can use whatever joining method that you prefer. Now I'm going to work single crochets all the way around. So if you added additional rows or rounds to your sleeve, you would just simply make single crochets all the way around. You can also substitute this with other stitches. So if you prefer to do a half double crochet or a double crochet, you can put whatever stitch you prefer. So for the single crochets, I'm just going to chain up, and then I'm just going to single crochet in each of those chain spaces, and then single crochet in each of the double crochets as I go along. And when I get to the end, I want to try to have an even number, just so it makes my decreases a little more easy. So if I have to work a couple of stitches together or skip over a stitch so that I end up with an even number, that's what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to continue to work in single crochet all the way around the perimeter of the bottom of my sleeve. And when I get to my corner spaces, I'm just going to simply place 1 stitch in each of the corners. So I will meet you back here after that first round of single crochets is complete. So I've just worked my last single crochet and I have an even number of stitches. Then to join in the round, I'm going to slip stitch into the top of that very first single crochet. And now I'm going to work a round of decreases. So I'm going to chain 1, and then starting in that very first stitch, that stitch that we just joined in, I'm going to make a single crochet 2 together. So I'm going to insert my hook into that first stitch, yarn over and pull through. So I have 2 loops on the hook, and then I'm going to insert my hook into that next stitch and yarn over and pull through. And I have 3 loops on the hook. I'm going to yarn over and pull through all 3. I'm going to do that again in the next 2 stitches here. I'm going to insert my hook into the next stitch, yarn over and pull through, 2 loops on the hook, insert my hook into the next stitch, yarn over and pull through, 3 loops on the hook, yarn over and pull through 3. I'm going to continue to work decreased stitches around the bottom perimeter of my sleeve till I get to the end. Now that I've reached the end of my round, I'm just going to slip stitch into the top of that very first decreased stitch. Now is another time where you might want to try your sleeve on and make sure that it works. If you've added too many decreases, you can go back in and take a few out and just put regular single crochet stitches in there. If you'd like to add some additional decreases, you can do another round and insert a few more decreases as you go. Just know that after you make your ribbing, it will bring the sleeve in slightly. Now I'm going to make the ribbing for my cuff, but before I do that, I'm going to switch out to a smaller size hook. Now I like to make single crochet ribbing for my sleeve cuffs, but you can use whatever method that you prefer. If you've never made single crochet ribbing or ribbing altogether, I have a detailed tutorial on how to do that. I will link it in the description below. So I'm going to start off with 7 chains. That way I have 6 single crochets to work into. This gives me about 1.5 inches. You can make your ribbing as long or as short as you prefer. It's also going to depend on your gauge. So starting in the 2nd chain from the hook, I'm just going to make single crochets all the way down those chains. And there's number 6. For this very first set, I'm going to work into the same stitch that I joined and just make a slip stitch. And then I'm going to slip stitch into the next stitch. And then going to turn and work the other side. Now I'm going to skip the first 2 stitches. Those were those first 2 slip stitches that I did. I'm going to skip and ignore those and work into that very next single crochet, inserting my hook into the back loop only. And now I'm going to work single crochets in the back loop only till I reach the end of my row here. I've reached the end of my row. I'm going to chain 1 and turn once again. Now starting into that first single crochet, so skipping my chain 1, I'm going to work in the back loop only again, all the way back down that row of ribbing. Here's my last stitch. So now I'm going to slip stitch into the next 2 stitches. I'm not going to slip stitch into this one like I did before. The repeat from now on is going to be to slip stitch in the next 2 stitches. So I'm going to slip stitch in the next one and slip stitch in the next one. And then just like before, I'm going to turn my work. I'm going to skip those first 2 stitches and working in the back loop only, I'm going to single crochet all the way back up. So now that I'm at the top, once again, I'm going to chain 1 and turn, and then working in that very first single crochet, I'm going to single crochet in the back loop. I'm going to continue to repeat this step, working up and down my rows of ribbing. And like I said, you can go back and watch that video if you like. I have a little bit more of a detailed explanation of how to do this style of ribbing. And I'm going to continue to work around my sleeve cuff until I come to my last stitch. And I will join you back here when that's finished. Now I've reached my last row of ribbing. I'm just going to simply cut my yarn and fasten off, and then I'm going to use a tapestry needle and this end that I just created to sew my seam shut. Here is what the cuff looks like after I've finished seaming along the edges. You can see that that ribbing does bring the cuff in just a little bit more. However, it gives it a nice flexibility that is comfortable to wear. Now you want to do everything that we just did for this cuff and repeat it on the other side for your other sleeve. Another finishing touch that you might want to add to your cardigan is to create a hem around the bottom. Now this is an optional step, but you can create whatever type of hem that you prefer. So if you want to add just some plain double crochet stitches around the bottom, if you want to add a shell stitch or more of a decorative border, you can do that, or you can just leave it as is. I'm going to add another row of ribbing along the bottom just because I like how it looks. So in order to do that, I'm going to flip this over so that way I'm working again from right to left, and this is the bottom edge of my cardigan here. And once again, I'm just going to start in that bottom corner and join with my yarn. And just like I did with the sleeve, I'm just going to work a row of single crochets. So I'm going to chain up one and work single crochets along the whole bottom of the cardigan, and I'll meet you back here after that's finished. And now I've reached the end of my row of single crochets, and once again I'm just going to switch my hook out for a smaller size for my ribbing. And once again I'm going to chain 7. You can make your ribbing as long or short as you prefer. And then once again, working in the second chain from the hook, I'm just going to work back down to make my ribbing. So I'm going to continue to make the ribbing along the bottom, just like I did for the sleeve cuffs. So I will meet you back here to show you how to do the next step, which is the button band. The last thing that I'm going to show you how to make for your cardigan is the button band. Now, whether you choose to add buttons and buttonholes to your button band is entirely up to you. However, it does leave a nice clean finish and a nice polished look for the front of your cardigan. So we're going to start at the very bottom corner and work our way up along the front panel, and then work around the back neckline, and then back down on the other side of the front panel. Once again, I'm going to start with single crochet stitches, just like I've done for the ribbing along the bottom and for the sleeve cuffs. So I'm going to join in the bottom of my ribbing here. Now, if you chose to do a different border, you just start at the very bottom of that border. And then I'm going to chain 1. And then I'm going to work single crochets along my ribbing along the bottom here. And now I'm going to continue to work along the body of the sweater, just as I've done before. I'm going to be placing a single crochet in any chain space as I come across it, and single crochets in each of the double crochets. So continue to work making single crochets, going up along one side, around the back neck. So working up here along the back neck, and then back down the other side of the front panel, and you'll end here. Now I've finished making my single crochets and I'm on the other end. And now it's time to start the ribbing for the button band. So a couple of things that you might want to think about before you figure out how wide you want your button band to be is first determine if you're going to be adding any buttons or buttonholes to it. So if you're adding buttons, you want to make sure that your ribbing is at least as wide, if not wider, than the buttons that you're going to be using. Now, if you're not going to be placing buttons or buttonholes into your ribbing, you might want to figure out how open you want the front of your cardigan to be. So obviously, if you're adding 4 inches of ribbing on each side, that's going to make the front of your cardigan more closed. And if you want the front of your cardigan to be more open, then you would just shoot for like maybe an inch or so. I like to do about 2 inches because it's right in the middle and it just works out really well. So now, just like before, I'm going to take my crochet hook out that I've been using for my body and replace it with my smaller hook for the ribbing. Now I'm going to chain out 9. This will give me 8 single crochets to work into, which is about 2 inches for me. So continue to work just as we have before for the sleeve cuffs and the bottom hem, making your ribbing. And this might be a good time to pop in a movie because this will take quite a bit of time to go around the whole front, sides, and back of your cardigan. If you plan to add buttons to your button band, here is a simple way to make a buttonhole. So the first thing you want to do is kind of measure your button in comparison to your stitches, and you want to make your buttonhole about half the width of your button because it will stretch. So for this, I'm going to do 4 stitches for the width of half of my button here. Since I have 8 stitches all together, I'm going to center that 4 into the center. So that means I'm going to work 2 single crochets on either side of the 8 single crochets that I have. I'm then going to chain 4 and skip over the 4 in the center. So I'm going to chain 1 here, and then I'm going to work in the back loop of the first 2 single crochets. I'm then going to chain 4. Then I'm going to skip over the next 4 stitches and then work in the back loops of the final 2 single crochets on my row. Then I'm going to slip stitch in the next 2 stitches here along the side and turn my work. Now I'm going to skip those first 2 that I slipped, just like I've done before in my ribbing, and work in those first 2 single crochets in the back loop. Now I've come to where my chain stitches are. I'm just going to work in those chain stitches like I would normally. So I'm going to go into each one, placing a single crochet. There's 3 and 4. And now I'm left with 2 single crochets on the end. I'm just going to work in the back loops of those. So this is just kind of a very rough way to make a buttonhole. And then you're going to want to check to make sure that it works. So just insert your button into the buttonhole and see if it slides in and out. If it slides out in and out too easily, then you've probably made your buttonhole too wide. You might want to go back and remove one of the stitches. However, if it's really difficult to insert your button, then you might want to add a stitch. And this is about where I want it to be. And it seems like it's going to be a nice buttonhole for this button. And I'm just going to continue to work as usual. After you've made all of your buttonholes, one thing that you can do to reinforce it is just to put some yarn on a tapestry needle and just stitch around the outer perimeter of that buttonhole just to reinforce it and keep it from stretching any further. Here is what the cardigan looks like after I have finished all of the details. Thank you for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends, as well as subscribe to my channel for more crochet tutorials.